And therefore, I'm going to tell you what the railway can do to the growth of nations and the continents. That is you can see it, for example, in what happened in Europe and North America. The US built the first transcontinental railway across North America in 1880s, linking eastern part of the country to the Pacific. This was a deliberate decision to just open up the interior of the continent. So they're building them from east to west. By 1850, Western nations, that the US and Western Europe, had 40,000 kilometers of railway line, while Africa, Asia, and Latin America combined had only 4,000 kilometers. One could say this is where regions and continents parted ways with regard to development. Because the paradox is, Africa is the richest continent in terms of resources. Yet the richest is also the poorest in terms of living conditions of our people. So that's when did the rain begin to beat us? Because they say, those in creation, that God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day. And they did not start in America via Europe and ending up in Africa. It was all together. Now how come we have Africa remain behind? That's the question. And I want to tell you that even here in Kenya, the railway worked wonders, as Victoria went with. As you know, on December 11th, 1895, Engineer George Whitehouse arrived in Mombasa aboard a ship that was called SS Ethiopia to start the construction of what was then known as the Uganda Railway. It was called Kenya-Uganda Railway. On 20th of December 1901, Engineer Preston completed the construction when the railway line reached Lake Victoria. His wife, Florence Preston, symbolically drove the last key into the line at the lake port, which was there after renamed Port Florence. The name later on changed to Kisumu. But so it took them about just 5 years to construct this line. This was indeed the railway in the wilderness of Africa, built at a time when every service required was provided by the builders themselves. They provided landing facilities at Mombasa, transport to move materials to construction sites, imported laborers imported from India, the Indian coolies, water supply, health services, and even food rations. The famous man-eaters of Savo did not make the work any easier. These man-eaters, they said they were so intelligent that they were unable to get them. They would come at night and pick workers from the site and go with them. And they would try to trap them by putting a ship on their way. But they would not go for the ship. They would go to another end of the camp and pick up somebody else. Until the worker said that these are not animals, these are genies. So they wanted to leave. But this 5 million pound meter gauge line was initially described as the Lunatic Express in the House of Commons. And one of the members of Parliament said words which have now become immortal, and I quote, when he was opposing the construction of the line the Kenya-Uganda Railway, said, what it will cost, no words can express. What is its object, no brain can suppose. Where it will start from, no one can guess. Where it is going, nobody knows. What is the use of it? None can conjecture. What it will carry, none can define. And in spite of George Curazon's superior lecture, that is the minister who's introducing the motion, it clearly is not but a lunatic express. Those are the words. So that's how it became known as the Lunatic Express. This word notwithstanding, this project was a major success, and it continues to be one of the greatest achievements in this part of the world. It is therefore self-evident that even in Africa, the social and economic transformation that we all long for cannot be attained without effective development and usage of railways. Just like the construction of the Uganda railways required vision and courage of the leaders who went ahead and completed the project despite the widespread criticism and skepticism, Africa must summon that same courage for the sake of the next generation. The railways we built back then were not kept up to date. They were terribly mismanaged, both financially and technically. They became victims of corruption and mismanagement. President Museveni likes to say, ours became a museum piece. But something you need to know, as the British were building this railway line, the Uganda Railway, the Germans also embarked on building the central line from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma. Then now there was competition. The Germans did not want the British to beat them to the Great Lakes. And they worked very hard. That's how these two corridors, the northern corridor and the central corridor, were constructed at the same time. It took the British 5 years to construct nearly 1,000 kilometers of railway line from Mombasa to Kisumu, and from thereafter to Kampala and Kasese, that is the border with Rwanda. We did not add any single inch in 50 years after that. As a result, we came to rely on roads for transportation, even as the roads were themselves left to decay, making it extraordinarily long to transport goods. The lack of reliable rail network over the decades put our industries and agriculture on tremendous competitive disadvantage, hindering our economic development. Transport costs absorbs about 40% of export value of some of our agricultural produce. In some cases, it takes just as long to transport a car from Japan to Mombasa as to transport it from Mombasa to Kampala. It has come all the way from Japan, in fact, a shorter period than getting it from the port of Mombasa to take it to Kampala. And I know that the examples I'm giving apply to other parts of Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa, and even Northern Africa. The competitive disadvantage became much greater for our landlocked neighbors. This is why high-speed rails running east to west, north to south, must be priority part of our infrastructure agenda. We must not shy from doing the Lunatic Express in our continent, because we know eventually we will be proved will prove the skeptics wrong. This is important. And we must make the decisions, hard decisions ourselves as Africans. Because most of those people outside will all the times come and scare you away. When Mwalimu Nyerere wanted to build the Tazara railway line, that would open up the southern corridor and make it easier for landlocked countries of Malawi and Zambia to export their goods. It was described by the World Bank and IMF as a white elephant project. He could not get any funding from it. Even the EU could not give him funding. So he went to China, and he was criticized for inviting the Chinese to come. When Mwalimu stood his ground and the railway line was constructed, and that actually eased a lot of pressure on Zambia and Malawi, who were too dependent on the hostile Boer regime in South Africa. So if you want to do something for the benefit of the African people, you should not be discouraged by what they're going to say. You must make decisions on ourselves as Africans. This is what we need, and we'll do it as Africans. Many of our countries in the interior of the continent are landlocked. We are talking about inter-African trade. But how do we trade within Africa if we don't have infrastructure? I'll give you an example. Kenya is only a stone's throw away from a country called Central African Republic. Between us and Central African Republic is only South Sudan. But how does Kenya, for example, send our coffee to Central African Republic? To do so, you have to put it on a ship and go all the way through the Cape of Good Hope. Then come up on the west coast of the continent, up to Douala in Cameroon. And then from there by road to Bangui. The French are faster there than us. Faster there than us. So how do we do this? By building a railway line that will go from the Lamu port through Juba and Bangui to Douala in Cameroon, and then connecting to Lagos. In Lagos we can go to Cotonou, to Lomé, to Accra, to Abidjan, and you can go all the way to Dakar, up to Rabat, and around. Then we will have the options. When the ships are not there, use the train. The import coming from the west, from the east, from Japan, from China, from India, can all come to the port of Lamu. And then from there they put on a train. The train will drop them in Juba, drop some in Bangui, then some in Douala, in Yaoundé. And then they will go like that way. Then the Chad will connect in, Niger can connect in, DRC, Uganda, all those landlocked countries will be able to connect in. The same with the goods coming from the West, from South America, North America, Europe, can land in Douala. And then they're taken and dropped on the way towards Lamu in Kenya. This is one way. And this is a project we call the Trans-African Beltway. It will open up the interior. And then you've seen the others in the south. And then the Trans-Sahara from Dakar to Djibouti. And then we come also down to north to south. These are things that need to be done, and they need to be done urgently. So my plea would be that we should not be spending years in doing feasibility studies. Studies themselves have become industries in the continent. You'll find a feasibility study, and then another feasibility study, then another feasibility study. I'll give you an example. Somewhere in Western Kenya, where I come from, there's an area which is prone to flooding. I used to run a consulting company, and the government had invited consultants to submit proposals for a feasibility study for flood control on that river. We submitted. In doing so, in preparing our proposals, we did a literature search. Then we found that in 1951, there were floods, and a company called Alexander Gibbs and Partners was constructed by the colonial government to do a feasibility study. That study we found. In 1961, there was another flooding. Another company, Howard Humphreys and Sons, were constructed. Another report was there. In 1964, the Russians came, did a comprehensive study, volumes, we found them there. In 1968, there were the Chinese, did also a study. Now, this is the time now, the Ital Consult. Now, there was also Norwegians, NORAD, had also done, NORAD Consult, had done also feasibility study. So if you take together the amount of money that was spent in those feasibility studies, there was much more than what was required to do the job itself. So feasibility studies have become industry themselves in the continent. And most of that money is going out of us. We must change this and find a way in which we can use our own resources, our own people, our brains, and give them a timeline to complete the studies so that we move to the next stage of implementation. And here is where I have also an issue. Right now, we have a lot of other projects which have already been studied, like on the highways, the Cape to Cairo, the Tripoli to Cape, Dakar to Djibouti, and so on. And there are several missing links. But the problem we have is that of capital to finance those projects. So we are trying now, we're planning to create an African infrastructure fund. And this is a conference we're going to have here in Nairobi next week, which is being convened by my office in conjunction with the Afro Champions. And we've invited several people to come. We've realized that in the continent there's a lot of money that is lying idle. There are a lot of pension funds, very huge pension funds. There are also sovereign funds. We're just lying idle. In South Africa, in Angola, in Nigeria, in Morocco, even here in Kenya. If we just took 5% of those sovereign funds which are lying idle and put it together in a pool, and then make it available for African countries to complete these missing links, we'll be able to have a whole road network and even finance some of these railway projects that we're talking about from our own internal resources. We need to do this before we go to the EU, before we go to the Americans, the Chinese. So you need to show that you have an option. If you don't have an option, then of course where you're going to borrow will put an equal terms on you. But if they know that you have an option here, then of course you'll be negotiating from a position of strength as Africa. This is what we want to do here. I want to say that we need to watch against corruption that doubles and sometimes triples the cost of such projects, as the rent seekers demand their cut while at the same time delivering shoddy work. You must invest in infrastructure, but do so diligently and ensure there's value for money in every infrastructure investment we undertake. These changes that we want to introduce will transform Africa and will make Africa assume its rightful place in the world. I talk about the African lion, and this is what my message in conclusion. The African lion message to the Asian tiger. The African lion is telling the Asian tiger that here I am, I'm the African lion. I've been asleep in the jungles of Africa, and you have continued to dance alone on the stage for far too long. The European bear retreated to the polars a long time ago. The American panda is also running away. So, but I am now awake as the African lion, and I'm standing on top of the African gold, African diamond, the African jungle, bounded by the rivers, the mighty river, the Nile to the east, the Congo in the middle, the Niger and the Gambia, the Limpopo and the Zambezi, Mount Kilimanjaro to the east and Mount Kenya, Atlas Mountains to the west, northwest. And I'm sitting on African gold, African diamond, African oil, African bauxite, African iron ore. And I'm going to transform all this wealth for the benefit of my people of Africa and claim the 21st century as truly an African century. Thank you.